Welcome to The Explainer. In Islam, the Prophet Muhammad is held up as the perfect model for humanity. But he was also, a man living in a specific time and place, making tough calls. So how can he be both a perfect guide and a human being? Well, today we're diving into a really fascinating framework from our source material that tries to square that very circle.
And this is really the heart of the puzzle, isn't it? On one hand, you have this idea of an infallible guide, whose example is meant for all people for all time. But on the other hand, historical records show us a person who lived a very human life, who could, in his personal capacity, make judgment calls that could be debated. How do those two things fit together?
This tension has pushed people into two opposite corners. In one corner, you have folks who almost elevate the prophet to this superhuman, near-divine figure. And in the other corner, you have his original critics back in Mecca who are saying, how can this guy be a prophet? He eats food. He walks around in the market just like us. Our source today says, well, both of those views are actually missing the bigger picture.
So how do we get out of this paradox? The source we're looking at proposes a really critical distinction. It argues that the Prophet Muhammad was essentially wearing two hats at the same time. Understanding the difference between these two roles, Nabi and Rasul, is the key to the whole thing. Let's break them down.
All right, first up, we have his role as Nabi, or prophet. You can think of this as his human hat. This covers his personal judgments, his cultural habits, his strategic decisions as a leader. This is the prophet as a general, a husband, a member of his community. A real person, in other words, living in his time and navigating the world with his own wisdom and experience.
And then there's the other hat, Rasul, or messenger. This was his divine function. When he was acting as Rasul, he was a pure conduit for God's revelation. Think of it like a perfect fiber optic cable, delivering the Quran without any distortion, without any personal opinion mixed in. And in this role, the message was divinely protected and demanded total obedience.
Okay, I know, Nabi, Rasul, it can feel a bit abstract. But don't worry, the source gives us a fantastic modern analogy to make it all click. A diplomat. Let's see how this plays out.
This lays it out perfectly. Imagine a diplomat reading an official statement from their government. Those words are non-negotiable, right? That's the state talking. But does that mean you also have to start liking their favorite brand of coffee or wearing the same kind of shoes? Of course not. That's their personal life. The source says this is exactly the same idea. The divine message delivered as Rasul is binding. But his personal habits as Nabi? Well, that was just him being human.
So you might be thinking, okay, that's a neat theory, but did anyone actually think this way back then? Well, according to our source, the answer is a huge yes. In fact, it argues the prophet's own closest companions understood this and acted on it, sometimes in incredibly dramatic fashion. So let's set the scene. We're at one of the most stressful moments in early Islamic history, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. The Muslims have traveled all the way to Mecca for pilgrimage, but they get stopped at the gates and are forced into a peace treaty with their enemies, and the terms felt like a total slap in the face.
The mood was just explosive. His followers were furious. They felt let down, and they weren't quiet about it. They went right up to him and challenged his leadership, basically asking, "What happened? You told us we'd be entering the Kaaba, and now we're signing this humiliating deal. What's going on?" They were questioning his human judgment.
And what happens next is just mind-blowing. The prophet gives a direct order to his followers to finish the rituals. He says, get up, do the sacrifice, shave your heads, and nothing, just silence. He repeats the command, still nothing. He says it a third time, and not a single person moves. Now think about that. These are his most loyal followers, and they are flat out refusing a direct order. The source says this could only happen for one reason. They understood he was acting as their leader, as Nabi, making a strategic call, not delivering a divine command as Rasul.
This is such a human moment. The prophet is clearly upset, so he goes into his tent and asks his wife, Saleme, for advice. Her counsel was simple and brilliant. Don't say another word. Just go out there and do the ritual yourself. So he does. He walks out and starts performing the rites. And only then, when his followers see his determination, do they finally get up and follow his lead. It was never a rebellion against God's messenger. It was a profound disagreement with their leader's strategy.
So what's the big takeaway here? It shows that it was possible to disagree with the prophet's personal judgment. And get this, the source points out that sometimes the companion's instincts were actually right, and a Quranic revelation would later confirm their position. In this particular case, though, the prophet's human strategy turned out to be a stroke of genius.
That treaty, which seemed so humiliating at the time, ended up paving the way for a huge victory later on.
Okay, so let's bring this into the modern day. What does this idea of two roles mean for how people today should follow the Prophet's example, his sunnah? Well, it can change everything. Let's see how.
According to this framework, if you don't separate the Nabi from the Rasul, you risk falling into a trap. You could end up treating absolutely everything the Prophet ever did, the specific clothes he wore, the kind of food he liked, 7th century military tactics, even medical advice from that time, as if it's all sacred, binding religious law for all eternity. The source argues, no, a lot of that was just him living his life as a man of his time.
And here is a fantastic, powerful example of this principle in action. Years later, Caliph Omar, one of the Prophet's closest friends, noticed that people were starting to treat the tree from that famous treaty as a holy site. So what did he do? He had it cut down. Why? Because Omar understood the difference. The Prophet resting under a particular tree was a historical event, part of his life as Nabi. It was not a divine ritual to be repeated forever as part of his message as Rasul.
Now, this idea of separating the eternal message from its historical container leads our source to a really fascinating, almost sci-fi kind of place. It takes a deeply metaphorical verse from the Quran and connects it to modern biology.
Okay, you're going to want to lean in for this one. There's a Quranic verse that talks about a covenant being taken from the backs of humanity. For centuries, people have read that as a beautiful metaphor. But the source asks, what if it's literally true? It turns out that in modern embryology, the cells that are destined to become our progeny, our descendants, actually first appear high up in an embryo's back, near the spine, before migrating down. The source poses this incredible question. Was the timeless message of the Rasul hinting at a biological fact that science wouldn't discover for another 1,400 years? It's a pretty wild thought.
So, whether we're talking about a dramatic historical moment or a detail of biology, it all comes back to this one core idea. Let's wrap things up by focusing on this crucial relationship between the message and the messenger who delivered it.
Our source really emphasizes the absolute purity of the divine message itself. It points to verses in the Quran that say, in some of the strongest language imaginable, that if the messenger had tried to invent even a single word and pass it off as revelation, he would have been stopped, completely and decisively. His job as Rasul was to be a perfect delivery system. That's it.
So here's the crucial takeaway from all this. Distinguishing between the Prophet as a man, the Nabi, and as a messenger, the Rasul, doesn't diminish him. According to the source, it actually clarifies his real status. It puts a protective barrier around the divine message, keeping it from getting tangled up with human culture or the specifics of history. And it allows us to fully appreciate the Prophet's humanity, his struggles, his brilliant leadership, his wisdom in a whole new way. It leaves us with a critical question we have to ask ourselves. When we study his life, are we looking at the timeless message, or are we looking at the incredible man who delivered it?